and then going for your presentation, which hopefully is about 20-25 minutes. And then we've got the recording as well, which we'll bring to other people. And then we'll open to Q&A in the normal fashion. So thanks, Adam. Go for it.
Great. So yeah, pleasure to be here. I hope to provide an engaging talk for you all to provoke some questions. And I was really enjoying looking at some of the previous presentations to this group, and I was actually really impressed the kind of breadth of types of interventions into the new entrant problem that were being considered. And so, and while I have been involved in a lot of work aimed at this level of designing solutions and interventions into addressing the many problems that farmers face, I've also spent time, I'm an academic. I have the luxury of researching things at a 30,000-foot level. And I think that's what I can really add value to this group is taking a step back and thinking more deeply about what is driving the new entrant problem. And really importantly, how the problem is being framed, which then leads to predictable interventions. So I think that's kind of the goal of this talk that I'll give for you all today. And I'm a researcher. I'm an academic. I come from the U.S., where I researched mostly monolingual Spanish immigrant farmers who were trying to transition from farm labor into being proprietors of farm businesses. And through that lens is how I come to understand and critique the kind of new entrant farmer problem. So I have some slides for you, and let's see if I can get it to go. All right, let's go window and PowerPoint slideshow. There we go. All right, hopefully that's working for you all. So, as this group well knows, there is a number of very serious problems, both facing agricultural systems that emerge, but also that emerge from agricultural systems. So regarding from the environment, rapid environmental change places new pressures for farmers to adapt, but also the practices that farmers choose to make can exacerbate problems in the environment, such as pollution or carbon emissions. Rural agricultural life and food culture is such an important contributor to well-being and economic vibrancy, but farms can be places of extreme exploitation, particularly with devalued labor and the stress that farmers may face to make their budgets work. Agriculture can contribute to securing the nutritional needs of nations, of the hungry, of distant consumers, but it also can contribute to malnutrition and an obesity epidemic. And on top of these contradictions exists a near global trend of an aging farm population that are lacking an exit strategy, sitting atop years of farm loss and farm consolidation. And this is leading policymakers and activists and nonprofits alike to collectively ask, who will do the work of farming in the future? So along this space comes the narrative of the beginning farmer as a solution to these problems. That these combining trends in agriculture, the problems, but also the aging farming demographic, creates an incredible challenge, but also an opportunity for the next generation. So here comes the narrative. In these emaciated rural sectors, young and beginning farmers, given the right skills, will seize the transitioning lands from retiring farmers and bring with them an alternative system that is ecologically minded, open to new innovations, and politically engaged. In fact, they must do this as a transition to the more labor-intensive forms of agroecology or regenerative agriculture requires the enrollment of many more highly skilled land workers than currently exist. Thankfully, a beginning farmer movement is afoot, made up of training organizations, land trusts, and farm incubators, mentorship programs, and these intuitions are rising to meet the challenge by training this new generation in green entrepreneurship. And farm by farm, the food system is being transformed. There's a lot of evidence that this is working from new food businesses, farmers markets, regional food hubs. And these will only continue to fill the geographies abandoned by the conventional food system. And that's a movement that will outcompete the traditional power players in agriculture. So this narrative that I just delivered, it can be predictably found at the start of any work or policy document associated with beginning farmers. I know because I've written a few times myself in some of my own work. But I think this narrative needs to continuously be scrutinized and challenged. By interrogating this beginning farmer story, the one that I just laid out, I think it shows that the dominant approaches to supporting new farmers can be problematic and even damaging to the express goals of new entrant support programs. And what the problem is in sum is, I think that the dominant beginning farmer narrative provides a very narrow imaginary of what agrarian life is and could be or was, that's grounded in concepts of individual improvement, technical agricultural proficiency, and private property ownership. So I think, it's not just me saying these things. I think we should take a look at some of the places where this narrative is, and who is pushing this narrative, right? So here's New York Times. In a new food culture, a young generation of farmers emerges. And I'd like you to think, who are the farmers being presented in some of these stories? What do they do? Where do they come from? This is a pamphlet from the Greenhorns, which is a very popular young farmer organization in the Northeast in the US. This is an article from The Guardian, Back to the Land, Are Young Farmers the New Starving Artists? This is imagery from the Young Agrarians group in Northwest Canada, the fist holding a carrot, bringing forth change. Here's a pamphlet from the National Young Farmers Organization, a guide for finding farmland and working with land trusts. This is the ecologically centered Orion magazine with a feature about the new farmers. This is Modern Farmer magazine, Meet a New Breed of Global Growers Embraces Agriculture. And finally, the Rockefeller-funded Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture, their Grow and Farmers Initiative, where they're offering an entrepreneurship intensive course and a Young Farmers and Cooks conference. It's not just these nonprofit spaces. Federal agencies like DEFRA and the USDA are focusing attention on this new generation on the land. So I think with this problem, with this type of narrative, is that the way it constrains the types of interventions, it sets up a very narrow vision of who these new entrant farmers are and what they do in order to be successful. A successful farmer in this narrative is one that kind of cracks the entrepreneurship code and excels despite the odds put against them. And in this narrative, I think there's a huge mismatch between the barriers that and all types of new entrants face and the types of interventions that come forth. And so how do the new entrant interventions attend to these problems? Well, the dominant is through the business of farming, right? Conferences, training mechanisms, schools in schooling in marketing and entrepreneurship. Here's an example, the Finding Farmland calculator, in which you identify a property that you wish to buy, a multi-million-dollar farm property, and then it'll help you calculate, if you have this much in down payment, how much type of loan you can take out, and the types of loans that you might be able to acquire. So this suggests that the pathway into being a new entrant is through acquiring your own farm property, and all that really, the barrier there is just the knowledge about how to get the right type of loans. Okay, here's that Young Agrarians group again. You have them offering a business boot camp. This is FAS Scotland, which runs a number of programs, starting up a business planning, financial management, how to do your taxes, alternative business structures. And what these all suggest is that the reason new entrant farmers haven't established on the land is that they haven't figured out how to make their books run in the black. But I think, as everyone with a deeper understanding of the food system really knows, I'd argue that it's really the broader forces of the agricultural system, in particular the land governance, of how we treat agricultural land, that creates an incredible incentive to consolidate and to scale up, and a food policy that is oriented towards monoculture commodity production, rather than the types of markets that new entrants usually tend in, which is the smaller scale and diversified. So here's a quote from a farmer in my research who finds themselves renting land because they can't afford to buy these farm properties. Being a renter influences the way you're farming. It's another issue you always worry about. Is this a place where I'm going to stay? Because you don't own it. Someone else can make a decision that will put you out of business. So we think about trying to invoke new entrants as bringing about ecological sustainability, but who's going to plant a tree if you're living on a short-term tenancy? Another way this plays out is in the types of interventions that are funded by the government. So I analyze in one of my papers the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. And this quote is from one of the grants that was received in terms of program. And they were making their pitch about what type of program they wanted to offer. And they said, here's the problem with immigrant farmers is that they frequently lack financial or production skills. They're unaware of technical resources and they lack English language proficiency for accessing technical information. So what we're going to do to solve that is we're going to help them develop small-scale enterprises by training in technical assistance that improve their financial and business skills, right? As if improving business skills is going to overcome these challenges of being an immigrant farmer in the US in terms of the availability of suitable language and networks, et cetera. And I think the critique that I'm offering here of the kind of entrepreneurial vision of new farm heroes is really summed up in this story from this quote from a farmer that I met who had done a long land search, could only find marginal lands that would match her budget, and the well on the property had just collapsed. And in a kind of powerful moment, she showed me this leather-bound valise that contained all of the certifications of completion that she had acquired throughout all of her farm training that she had done. She had gone through an incubator and graduated out of it. And she said, what good is it to me? They say what great work you have done organizing with farmers, how good that you're a leader, what a good example you are. What good is it to have recommendations from all these organizations and trainings? I've done programs, courses to educate myself more, learn about business. What good is it for me? Tell me it doesn't make any sense. So this farmer is kind of recognizing the point that you can be a skilled farmer. You can be someone who is skilled at producing high quality, nutritious food, who has the ability to market, who knows how to work with soil quality improvements, who has done the training, who's accepted all of the stuff that their government has offered them. But it doesn't really translate to being able to establish as a dignified rural job and livelihood. So I think it's worth, in this mismatch to try and take a step back and maybe ask a slightly provocative question: is trying to make new farmers even the right question? Is that a right goal to be asking? Is this a useful starting point for mobilizing action and change in the food system? And if you think about it, I think it's actually a really strange question. How do we make new farmers? When there's a call to do something new, it's usually a call for something that doesn't exist yet. Like we should be trying to invent something. But the idea of newness suggests that there's an absence. But what's really happening in the farming sector is loss, dispossession, control. Creating new laborers, new farmers, new bodies into that system, one that's set up to lead to commodity production that tends towards consolidation, to articulation with agribusiness, to a race to the bottom production patterns, to the exploitation of labor, aligning with global trade rather than local food systems. That doesn't seem like a good idea to encourage new people into that system. Especially for disadvantaged farmers who are historically excluded from the benefits of land ownership and the benefits of agricultural subsidies, who then get blamed for not having enough grit or entrepreneurism when they fail, who might get laughed out of banks, and offices. I think that this problem is very highlighted there. But even for farmers who are held up as success stories, for those who work their whole career in another business and then dump that capital that they've saved up into a vision of an agri-biodiverse system, they still have to do the marketing, they have to do the entrepreneurship, they have to sell themselves, in a kind of neoliberal subjectivity kind of way. I was really thinking about the presentation from Clinton Devon Estates, where they had this really strong vision of what types of farmer they wanted, and then this tendering process where the farmers had to present themselves into their vision of what being a good farmer would be. And yeah, these are the farms that get the movies made about them and are incredible to learn from. But even for those farmers with all of the resources they have, it's still an uphill battle. And as we learned from that presentation, still requires a lot of off-farm income. They still have to contend with this agricultural system that's designed to squeeze the middle and fetishize the niche production. So it's like doing all of this work to inspire and train a new generation, but it's like, then to what end? New farmers for what? Where are they going? And so I don't know if the goal of creating new farmers makes much sense at all. And I think to encourage all of you, next time you might hear that as the starting point for policy circles, how do we create new farmers to maybe respond with, well, first we should figure out what happened to the old ones. So, I mean, that's usually where my presentations end, because as an academic, I don't have to do the hard work of figuring out how to translate these critiques into policy. But I think, particularly for this presentation, I tried to think what would be an alternative to just trying to think how to create new farmers into the system, right? What would be some other ways to direct new entrant policy? And I came up with some bullets that I'd love to hear your feedback on. What about instead of to create new farmers, you would use that same funding instead of training to appointing and funding long-term representation of disenfranchised farmers to the many sites of decision-making on land and agriculture, on planning boards, to the housing development consultations, to trade policy. What about, instead of trying to focus the training on new entrants, what about bringing the powerful actors in which the food system is working for, the landowners, the banks, the supermarkets, and the councils, to change how they do their business in order to fit what new entrants need? Often it's trying to get new entrants to conform to these players. What about trying to engage what those different entities can do? What about identifying areas of policy and coherence and lobby for an agriculture, nutritional, and environmental policy coherence model? And I'll have an example of that in the next slide. And what about, instead of trying to train new farmers, what about just directly trying to create a land fund to acquire land from the farmers who don't have a good exit policy, and then setting up farms that demonstrate new policy coherent models that demonstrate the values of what people want from their food system? So my partner actually works in early childhood education, and she was telling me about the new milk and healthy snack scheme in Scotland, and it's coming online in 2021. And this is upfront funding to the childcare centers because they are now mandated to increase their hours. So the children there who will be offered a snack as part of this extended hours. And in more discrete terms, it covers a 1/3 pint of milk and a healthy snack portion for fruit and vegetables per child per day. But here's where new entrant farmers for what actually is a really helpful starting point, because what does the scheme say about where they should get their milk, and what is healthy, and what types of snacks they should be eating? Well, if you look at the fine print, it says we expect settings will wish to continue supply arrangement with existing suppliers. So that's no change, that's no transformation. But it encourages milk, fruit, and vegetables to be sourced locally. They expect childcare settings to adhere to environmental standards, and we encourage settings to source products. So here we have an example of a policy that's aimed at childhood nutrition. So that's a value that the policy is aimed to try and solve, but it's not coherent with perhaps a new entrant policy, right? There's no alignment there. And you might create a mismatch in which the policy actually is subsidizing existing commodity production. But there's an incredible opportunity there through procurement mandates to move maybe even one step beyond voluntary. Is that too much to ask? In which maybe 10%, 20% could come from maybe new entrants, maybe some type of sustainable agriculture mandate. These are the types of policy coherence that is much more difficult to achieve, but that could be truly transformative. And next, what about farm incubators? I thought I would just comment about this more specifically, because I think incubators work in a kind of hybrid that sometimes they fall into the trap of the critique that I'm making, and they may overemphasize farm training. In my experience, what happens after farms leave the incubator is they enter an entirely different land and market relationship that is not being practiced in the incubator, and then it creates a lot of difficulties for them to establish. But what I think incubators do a good job of is they say, look, this is how agriculture could work, where an existing piece of land is broken up into smaller parcels, where farmers work together instead of compete against each other, where there's some oversight into create a solidarious market for the types of agriculture that new entrants want to produce. And to that end, there's a good example happening with the James Hutton Institute, that one of their long-standing research farms, the Glensock farm, which is over 1,000 hectares, is trying to rebrand itself as a climate positive farming initiative to demonstrate and do the research about how farming can be done to match a certain value, which is carbon sequestration. And what I have acquired a small grant to do is to try and explore how, instead of just doing research and then delivering it out to others, to try and transform that farm into more of a farm incubator model, to invite new farm tenants to explore climate positive farming, but from that farmer to farmer learning method rather than from a research and delivery method. But then again, what happens once farmers graduate from these incubators but enter an entirely new land governance regime? So I think I'll sum with three main points. The first is if you just focus on making more new entrants into a system without addressing the forces that shape that system, I think you end up entrenching the status quo while looking like you're solving the problem. I think instead of new farmers trying to make new farmers, ask, what happened to the old ones? Why has agriculture trended into the space where new entrants need to be created? Address that first, or at least in parallel. And finally, I think asking new entrant farmers for what is a much more politically engaged question to ground future action. That forces policy to grapple with what type of agriculture should be produced, what food should be produced, not just to produce a more number of farmers into the existing system. All right, I hope that was a provocative talk for you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about it.
Thank you very much, Adam. That was certainly a provocative talk, and hopefully will generate an interesting discussion. And Sarah is straight into it.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you very much. That's an incredibly interesting presentation. I just wanted to go back to thank Henry for joining the YFC Agri Group last night and picking up on the need for what you thought the need was for future collaboration, which I think Adam's highlighted. And I noticed it in particular, perhaps the need for government departments and different industries collaborating so that there can be perhaps a better, more innovative offer to help new farmers, existing farmers. Is that a fair assumption, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I'm part of this Horizon 2020 project called NEWBIE that's looking at 9 countries in Europe all trying to address this similar problem, because it's a near, at least in the global north, a similar challenge. And I think that's because there is similar agricultural policies and private property rules in all of these countries as well. And what you see is that idea of trying to bring, supermarkets and banks to change their methods seems too difficult. So what we do is we focus. It's easier to write a smaller grant about a pedagogy course, new entrant activity, but then, those empowered farmers go out and they're still facing the same way that banks approach loans, the same way that supermarkets do their contracts and assess quality of produce, the same way that trade policy favors certain types of agriculture over others. So, there's not an easy answer excepting to trying to increase the democracy on those kinds of conversations. And if there was young farmer groups, alternative farmer groups who are consistently at that table to say, that doesn't really work for me, then potentially I could see more emergent, discourse that would go beyond some of the dominant new entrant farming models that I see.
Thank you.
Thanks. One thing, Adam, did you look at the webinar we had with looking at the sort of new supply chain systems in the southwest of England, Tamar Local, for instance, who are really looking at sort of, I suppose, putting into practice some of the stuff you're talking about in terms of developing new relationships along the supply chain between customers and producers, I guess. And also, actually, there's a Lynn Davis that presented on the potential of data systems to support this and create the level of, to compete effectively, i.e., become provide just-in-time supplies and more efficiency while retaining democracy, more sort of democratic relationships, if you like, and in which people have more voice. I mean, it might be worth. I don't know if you looked at those and whether they gelled at all with your thinking.
So they certainly do. I think that addressing the market relations, I'd like to draw a distinction. There's usually new types of market relations. One that is building off a consumer base that doesn't exist, right? And that is one that kind of relies on the premium prices of more wealthy consumers, right? And those consumers work together with the type of farming they support. And then, but it's about solving the types of logistical problems of many smallholders and aggregating produce, so you're able to have a diversity and meet a blend of consumer needs, right? But that is, in the academic literature, is overwhelmingly antagonistic to this model as a truly transformative solution, because it only leads to someone like me being able to improve my moral economy and my nutrition. There's a difference between, in which I do have hope for, a public procurement policy that is much more aggressive to figuring out how to switch their demand and their upfront payments. And I think that starts to actually make a small change into some of the market logics, where you might see some of these someone who can be skilled in just growing food and have a price that and a plan that matches their vision. So, and I think some of those presentations, delved into that, trying to work with procurement systems. But the kind of bottom-up markets, they might sustain a small niche, and we should celebrate those livelihoods that are supported. But I don't think we should think about that as a transformative model. But maybe that's not the goal. Maybe we're not looking for full transformation.
Interesting. Rob. You're muted. Yeah, now you are.
I'm muted.
By the way, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry. My name's Rob Hitch. I'm a partner in an accountancy practice up in Cumbria, but I also am chair of the Farmer Network Board in Cumbria, which, amongst other things, it has a scheme that used to be funded by the Prince's Countryside Fund and the Prince's Trust to try and get new entrants into farming up here. So have a vested interest in trying to do things. What I was taken about by your talk, Adam, was that you talked about, is trying to make new farmers the right goal, and should we be just creating the right opportunities, I suppose. But then at the end, on your last slide, when you were summing up, one of the points was, what are new farmers for? And I suppose if you were taking a UK basis, where we have, production isn't dropping, so output and productive capacity of the agricultural industry doesn't change. Unless it's dropping, do we need new entrants, I suppose, is the question. Things are all being delivered by the existing people. But if the bulk of the requirements of people that want to get into farming are access to land and access to capital, are they the sorts of, and that's driven by policy decisions. You only have to look at the response to the COVID crisis and things like the bounce back loan, where all of a sudden any business could get an unsecured loan backed by the government to run the business. Is something like that something that could be targeted, I suppose, towards people getting into agriculture in future? We now have the government have invented a system of doing it and underwriting it, whether they choose to spend the money that way rather than, as you say, spending it a bit more business knowledge or knowledge transfer on bits and pieces that might not be as relevant. So
I think it's a good question. First of all, I don't think that there necessarily needs to be new farmers. In some of my interviews with a farm manager, for example, I posed that question to him, and I said, do you think we need to create new farmers, or do you think someone like you, who has really, really efficient production and is experimenting and has capital, there was some duke who owned the land that they were farming, and he had good tenure. I said, actually, that's a good question. I think I would just probably do better at that land, and why don't I just take over the exiting farmers' land, and I'll just expand, right? And in terms of a nation food production, there is a future in which if the kind of the climate and biodiversity narrative becomes very strong, or production, depending on whatever value, this is what new entrant farmers for what, right? Then you could have a highly productive, highly biodiverse landscape, but just with very few people, managing it. And so then it becomes a debate over values of what is the countryside for, and what do you want rural spaces to look for? And I think those kind of questions need to be in there. Regarding your question of just the capital to get the land, I think if you put anyone with a healthy body and enough capital and secure tenure, they can produce good food. So I don't necessarily think it's because that they haven't figured out how to market their stuff on Instagram, that they won't succeed. The problem is those assets are extremely sought after and deliver incredible value to whoever hold it. So as long as that is the main rationale for holding those assets, the adage that the farmer's wealth is in their assets, not necessarily their production model. I don't see anyone jumping at that chance, or I don't see that as being, I would see strong pushback for that model, but that would be something that would be along the lines of like a more almost a land reform style intervention into this question, rather than a supporting new entrant capacity style approach to the question with drastically different implications.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. I got sort of kicked out somehow on my sentence. I'll come in on a different one, so so I missed some of that. But I might just ask a question, because it's interesting, Adam, that what you're saying, because in our first sort of workshop with our what we call our co-design steering group, one of the sort of buckets of issues that were identified with what we call the sort of system, the thinking about the system disadvantages and blockages, and thinking about the need for connectivity and markets and all that sort of thing. And so in our sort of response to that is to think that we're setting up these incubator hubs, and one of their roles will be to connect with potential collaborations and efforts to change the relationships, and I suppose also efforts around in the Southwest. There is efforts around, I think, procurement, and there are sort of developing models. So I suppose we have a challenge, because our mandate is to create structures to support new entrants in, but how can we do that in a way that also joins up with other more system level activities, if you like. So I don't know if that helps. Hopefully that will help some. We probably don't have a mandate to do land reform.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of the problem, right? Is that these policy mandates, they have to form a frame of the problem, but then that then kind of prescribe some of the potential interventions. But I also don't expect, I think, so let's think about incubator hubs. I mean, of course, you only have certain levers that you can pull within the certain groups, and whether that's wise strategically. I think in France, you learned probably from Land Workers Alliance about the Renetta group, the large network of incubators, that I think maybe there's a chance that forms a critical mass where you have such new activity happening around new entrants that there is a stronger voice for some of those more long-term policy reforms that then would meet the needs of the people emerging from those programs, right? But I think to what extent can those programs be engaged in the systems questions as well as the capacity questions? So that seems like an important parallel process that could help those programs reach that systems level. I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud. And I think in France, the reason it's so successful is there's a stronger social safety net in which the farmers who are on the incubator land are receiving unemployment benefits, so that they can really experiment with their business model. And if they don't really like it, it's okay to fail and they go back and do something else. Where I don't think the incubators in the UK necessarily have that same level of support.
Okay, thank you. Rob, you want to come back in?
Well, I think to my mind, and I think Adam's probably said it, you know, in a roundabout way, is that actually the barriers to new entrants, or the barriers to people changing, is perhaps the access to the land availability, the, you know, capital requirements, bits and pieces, more so than other bits and pieces. But you know, there might be ways around sorting the capital, but actually to get access to land, it probably is more fundamentally about land reform and tax reform and much bigger changes that DEFRA will have no control over. and that a stroke could make life easier or more difficult depending on how it's all framed. But whether DEFRA should be you know, contributing to some of those, you know, I don't know who feeds into Treasury as to what, you know, changes are on tax or land reform or anything like that. But is it am I right in thinking, or I've heard, I'm sure, might be wrong, in Germany, do you sort of, you know, if you get a state pension, you're not allowed to claim basic payment? You know, little things like that you could do in the UK, which would effectively, you know, so you're not double subsidised. You either get a state pension or you get single farm payment or basic payment or sustainable farming initiative or whatever it's going to be next year. But would that open the doors, because it makes it more difficult for some people to carry, you know, or it means that people have to retire, and that does create space for new entrants? I think the big problem at the moment is people are very reluctant to retire, so there isn't enough space for new entrants to fill.
I mean, I can keep adding in my own comments, but you probably know what I would want to say by this point. I think just as a more general point, one of the things that's consistent in my research that I just try and bring up is there are often, which is the policy coherence. You can have an environmental aim, you can have a nature-based solutions aim, you can have a regenerative farming aim, but then those ideas get filtered through the land governance, and they often tend to be defeated by the way land is governed. And so I think saying, if we want environmental or rural economy or rural vibrancy or nutrition objective A, B, and C, what could be the alternative land governance arrangements to help deliver those as well? And I think why the incubator is kind of the exception that proves the rule is you take a piece of land and you create a totally different type of land governance, and then new entrants can populate it, and they work together, they aggregate their produce, they learn from each other. Maybe they don't have to do the tax stuff. Maybe a different NGO helps with, you know, doing the paperwork so that they can focus on farming. But that's because the land has been removed from the dominant land governance situation. They're more like insulators, you know, rather than incubators. Yeah.
So have we got any others, people who'd like to contribute to this interesting debate? Claire, I see you're there from the Real Farming Trust. I wonder if you've got a perspective on this.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, Adam. I'd be really interested to look into some of the rest of your research. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, the whole issue of land access is something that we have talked about, I think, in the co-development group as well. And particularly with respect to thinking about the new entrants, we did talk about, as part of those discussions, about having some sort of idea about what the pathway was, exactly as you were saying. So, you know, what happens to people once they have actually been on the new entrant scheme. So I think this is certainly a live topic within the context of the group as well. But obviously acknowledging these are not straightforward problems to address in any way. But, you know, I fundamentally agree with you that is absolutely the nub of it, really. I wondered, though, whether there was anything more that you could say about that research that you've been doing around Horizon 2020 and the experiences of you know, from the research that you've done across Europe, and what particularly has struck you. I mean, I don't know at what point you are in that research, or whether you're not really in a position to share any of that yet, but that would be quite interesting for us to understand what learnings you've gathered from that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is through my own lens, you know. So I think a lot of the models that are being put forth as worthy of sharing, if you look under the hood, you see farmers with lots of mobility. So those who can travel to places where land is not as expensive, to farmers who are coming on a second career. So those who have previous skills in engineering or maybe marketing or communication, who can kind of take advantage of niche. Those who are really focusing on value-added products. And it's hard not to celebrate those farms. I love being on those farms. I love imbibing the products from those farms. But the question is that enough? You know, and it's not really for me to say. At the other hand, land access is a huge problem across all the different countries. And the types of models that you see kind of rising to the top are these types of collective land funds, where you have, it's kind of like I think there's enough examples in the UK to kind of imagine them scaling up, where you have basically any kind of mechanism to decommodify land so that a different decommodified form of agriculture can succeed there. You know, so a share offer where many individuals contribute their share. Maybe the organization will offer a small percent return that could be competitive, and that will beat a local bank in terms of the savings rate, maybe 3%. And with that aggregated fund, they buy land and then offer it to new entrants. Again, it's creating these little islands, right? But is there? And this is one of the reasons I was drawn to Scotland, because there's more of it's taking that model and creating a national policy around land reform that goes to match with it. That seems to be a little bit more trying to match the problem at its scale. But of course, there's different contexts in different places. And then I think in my interviews with farmers across the UK, there's this strong tension that farmers want to do agriculture for a whole host of reasons, and then the need to make it a productive enterprise. You know, they want to do it to care for people in their community. They want to do it for ecological reasons. They want to be their own boss. All these other like diversity of human flourishing motivations for agriculture, but then like the entrepreneurial side, they feel that pressure and the choices that they make to constrain that model. So that's what I've been finding in my research, and I can pass resources from NEWBIE in general. Just to, one of the best things is this archive of YouTube videos that showcase the farms, and that have all been translated into English so that you can see, and I think it's just a great resource to see a diversity of ways that new entrants are trying to approach, and you can see if my critique holds across those different farms.
We got Graham. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. You've raised some very interesting questions. I suppose trying to come at this, I suppose one thing you're fundamentally saying, this is a supply side issue in terms of land and land governance rather than demand side. So the demand will always be there for people to move off the land. I guess I'd say that all this is being shaken up in the UK, as you know, and so the question is how all these bits of the jigsaw settle down in the next few years, because clearly ELM and changes to direct payments can change the sort of financial model. So it raised questions about what farming will be doing in the future and how it will be viable and what it will look like. And then there's this questions about internalizing costs and so forth. But probably the most important thought for me is what a couple of things to add is will we get to the point where we think about the social dimension of farming and what it's for, rather than thinking about it being producing food and for public goods in a kind of narrow sense of environmental public goods, and whether there isn't a really important bit that we tend to miss is the social dimension. Obviously, Prince of Wales this morning has talked about the loss of family farms and ripping out the backbone from rural communities. So there's their question about their role within communities and what that does for our relationship to food, relation to understanding how food is produced, to farming and wider issues. So there's a sort of social connection issue about what rural communities are and what they do for our understanding. And secondly, I suppose the other point to make would be in terms of land supply. I mean, maybe in terms of having a social model of what farming should be doing, or trying to engineer that from the land we have. There are big semi-institutional states which might and could be. I mean, I think without shaking up the whole market and changing the whole sort of settlements of free markets or notionally free market economies, there are large institutional states that might be persuadable to go down the route of thinking about a wider set of values and measures that they could be trying to deliver through their farming. And so we've got the Crown Estate and the Church Commissioners Estate. Even it might even be MOD land, county farm estates, as Henry will know well, we've talked about before, which might have a much wider set of purposes, which would make sense of, you know, having new types of people coming into farming. And I guess the last thing to say is that one of the real challenges is the sort of notion that large is always the most efficient. And I've sort of tried to tackle this over the years, and I think it's not absolutely clear. There are economies of scale to be had, but of course, I think we need that rhetoric that large is always the best needs to be challenged, so we get away from this idea of consolidation as always being the right way forward. And that's still a very, very big battle, I think. I'm sure Treasury still thinks bigger farms are always more efficient, but it's efficiency very narrowly framed. So we have to somehow change that understanding and that sort of general assumption that the bigger you get, it's always going to be bigger when it goes beyond a certain scale. It might be 500 hectares is the most efficient, not 2,000. You know, I don't think we've really got to the bottom of that. Sorry, I rambled on a bit, but I hope those are useful things to throw at you.
I love everything you said, Graham. I think what you're doing is connecting what farming is with the new entrant question, right? And that changed the types of policies that needs to be considered and what type of players need to be brought on. So an important something to think about. Access is, in the academic sense, is often confused with ownership, but access is really just the ability to benefit from a resource and all the different mechanisms that are played. So I think there are a whole host of potential innovations in which landowners can continue to own the land, but which access is more equitably distributed to people who are currently landless. And I think for there, that could be please both parties in different ways, in which it's really about the ability to benefit from those resources that needs to be shifted rather than just the complete the control over the asset itself. And you're also talking about, in an academic world, the types of discourses that motivate change. And if you look at kind of farming movements from other parts of the world, and particularly in the global South, new entrants would be more considered like a landless people, right? People without land who are demanding that. And that has served to be a mobilizing discourse that's won some concessions. But what I think the entrepreneurial vision of new entrants, and I think this group in some of the presentations is starting to go beyond that already, that tends to suggest that new entrants is narrowly defined, and it limits the potential of mobilizing discourses that you talked about in terms of more efficiency through an agricultural matrix, through diversified agricultural production, through agroecology, that actually not only succeeds in producing healthy food for near and distant consumers, but also safeguards biodiversity and produces rural livelihoods. That these types of mobilizing discourses to kind of reshape agriculture, I think I would love to see those come from the new entrant space, as long as it's focused on these classrooms of making it individual units successful. I think you limit down the potentials of what you were talking about in terms of those broader questions. So I think that's great.
Rob, you wanted to come back?
Well, just picking up on Graham's point really about obviously the Prince of Wales this morning saying if we're not careful we'll lose all these small family farms and that'll destroy the community, rural fabric of places, which potentially does happen, but presumably we still end up with people on them. It's one of the big contributing factors to that, the big drive by DEFRA to effectively fund robots and take people out of farms. I've got clients who expand, are building dairy units. They get a grant if they put robots in and don't employ anyone and keep people in the community, and they don't get a grant if they build a parlour, which keeps people, so they build a parlour, keep everyone locally, or they put robots in and get rid of staff and actually they get grant for getting rid of the staff. Whereas if we want to keep people in the community, we should be not giving them grant for robots and stuff that reduces labour use. We should be encouraging more labour use by not throwing money at mechanisation.
Yeah, I think that's actually a strong concern. I think to think deeper about that, the techno-optimists have a strong vision of what agricultural labor should be, and that's non-existent. They would rather there's this problem of devalued labor, about making COVID exceptions for flying in agricultural laborers just in time to pick fruit, under unsafe conditions, right? How to solve that problem is to make the labor go away. And that's actually very clear. I can actually put my mind around that, but the new entrant vision is much more muddy and not as clear, how like lots of people on the land working together, do some of these farms as they scale up, do they start hiring labor, or is it all family labor? Is family labor? I thought that our labor laws moved away from family labor, So I think that question and the inability to have a clear vision of what agricultural labor should be, it's a long agricultural debate, but on the other side, there is a strong vision through the mechanization, which is to make it go away. Yeah.
I think at this point I might just say, although this is not my policy area, but my understanding is that a shortage of labour is the issue. Obviously, that's been caused by various things, and actually, I think across the piece, I mean, you read in the newspapers there is a shortage of labour around various places. So there may be it could be said that I think that the government is responding to a problem rather than trying to expel people who are there. But I'm sure there could be a long discussion about that. Who else would like to join this fascinating? This is an unusual webinar where I think we've got into bigger areas than we normally do, but I think that's interesting, and it does. I would say, we have touched in a sense on this before by thinking of systems and having that in view. But I think Adam is an interesting point. Can we create incubators that can do both and that are looking outward and also supporting? I think the link may be, for me, in that what we've talked about is the incubators as a role of linking up and relationship building in terms of supporting the journey of new entrants, obviously onto land, with working with landowners, all that sort of thing. So, and that could easily be also working with food hubs, also connected to NHS procurement, which you mentioned, which I think is very interesting. And obviously there's a growing agenda around tackling obesity and access to healthy food and so on. So obviously that is all beyond the scope of our particular initiative, but creating that capacity and recognizing that need to connect. And as I think Sarah said early on, we're very much seeing the skills of collaboration as a key sort of area for development, and that the development is not just training courses people will receive, but they'll actually go and see models and what's happening elsewhere. They'll learn from peers. They will, they'll be looking well beyond some, just some sort of entrepreneurship training, how to do accounts, etc. Because I think we recognise that in the changing circumstances, different sorts of collaborations, connections, links, etc., need to be made. How exactly that's made and the resources to do that, of course, is another question. And presumably a lot of this will depend on having the right sort of people taking up that role at the centre of incubators, because they'll have to know all about farming, but also markets, structures. They'll have to be really good at relationships and know all the people in the patch and how to link up with them, a whole diversity of people, etc., etc. So it's It'll be a challenging job, but I think very worthwhile for anyone who's thinking, anyone who's considering it. We're just about to the end of our time. We've got 3 minutes left. No one's got their hand up, but this is your last gone for any last thoughts before I ask Catherine to tell us what treats we have in store for next week after this very enlightening and inspiring and also obviously challenging conversation we've had today. Graham.
Yeah, just a very quick question. Based on the incubator model, do we think that will create the kinds of people who will want to just run at the same scale, if you like, in the future on smaller holdings, which can work because they do direct supply and are integrated in supply chains, rather than the kind of farms which they may just grow and grow and grow and grow and get bigger and bigger? Will we end up with a kind of polarized situation where we have very large farms that work intensively at scale and then lots of smaller farms on your model supported by incubators? Do you think that's the way you see it going?
I really don't know, but I mean, if you listen to Jeremy Moody, he says that, you know, the model of bigger farms are better and the sort of trying to spread your overheads over as much land as possible is the model of the past, not of the future, because it's basically it's based on a sort of commodity production efficiency model, and effectively he sees as that we'll never be able to compete. You know, such models will never be able to compete in the global context. And his analogy is with the 80s and the change where all our industry that was based on mass production disappeared, and what was left was niche, value added, knowledge intensive, etc., etc. And so although obviously he doesn't necessarily say it's going in the same direction, but you know, that may be an analogy that you know, makes more sense. And actually, as a last, I'll take the opportunity to make a last remark. It's interesting to whether that might affect, if you like, the power relationships between the landowners and tenants in terms of who needs who. But thank you very much, Adam. I think I'm really glad you joined us to bring a whole new dimension, I think, to the conversation, which is fantastic. Catherine, can you just remind us what we have next week, who we have?
Yes, sure. So in the comments right now, we do have some messages from Cindy, which I think is for you, Adam. I think she wants to connect with you regarding one of the reports that she's written. And for next week, we have Steph Weatherall from Land Workers Alliance. She'll just be discussing her work with a mentoring program that's, I think, about 2 years in the running, regarding helping get mentoring for new entrants and the best support that is available.
Brilliant. I have just seen your comments now, Cindy. I'm sorry I didn't pick them up earlier. I've been having a slightly challenging technical time, but hopefully you have a chance to connect with Adam and ask further questions outside this event. But thank you very much, everyone, and hope to see you in a week's time. And then after that, by the way, I'm going to present where we're at with the process and get sort of test out thinking and so forth on the last one of our July, and then we can take August off from webinars. But hopefully you can make the last Wednesday in July, and so we can you know, put out our thinking and get some challenge and questions and test where we've got to in terms of playing back things we've heard from multiple and diverse people over the last few months. Brilliant. Thanks all, and a great event. Cheers then.
Thank you.
Bye.